Hello everybody, how's things? How's life? Hope everyone is staying healthy and keeping busy, right? So today, right, we're going to be starting with the urinary system. Now, when we think about the urinary system, right, that includes the kidneys, right, these things. Come on, there we go. There we go. That includes, right, the kidneys. Right, here's a kidney, and here's a kidney. Right, the kidney along with the ureter, which is this here, and the ureter, this here. Right, the ureters are going to carry urine down into the urinary bladder. Right, the kidneys. Right, when we talk about the kidneys, we always think about, oh, they filter the blood, which is correct. They do filter the blood. Right, I mean, they're much more complex than that, but one of the main responsibilities of the kidneys is to monitor the concentration of the blood. For instance, if there's too high sodium levels in the blood, or if there's too high of chloride or potassium or magnesium, whatever it happens to be, calcium, right? One of the responsibilities is that your kidney can eliminate it. Same thing with BUN or something called creatinine. Right? These are things that your kidney filter out and dispose of. Right? The kidney has this kind of filtration unit, this filtration process that it goes through, and it eventually produces the urine. And that urine enters down into the ureters, again these tubes here, and eventually go to the storage port, being the urinary bladder. Now, right, we've talked about, in 121, right, talking about the respiratory system. One of the major responsibilities of the respiratory system was to act as a buffering system, right, meaning it helped to regulate the pH of the blood. So too does your kidneys. Right, that's one of the main responsibilities of the blood, is to buffer the blood, right, to make sure that the blood has an appropriate pH. Again, the pH of the blood, right, somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45. Right, so it's slightly alkaline, right, or 7 is neutral. So it's just above that, right? But there has to be it's a very small range, 7.35 to 7.45. Again, it's a small range. But that's part of the reason why the kidneys receives as much blood as they do, right? In order for the kidneys to filter out the blood, they have to receive the blood, right? That's why at any given time, right, around 20 to 25% of your cardiac output, meaning, around 1/4 of all the blood your heart is pumping is getting diverted to the kidneys. That's tremendous, right? Your kidneys are like the size of your fist, right? So why is it something the size of your fist has that much blood devoted to it? That's the reason why, right? Because your kidneys are constantly filtering and adjusting the composition of the blood. So as we go through, right, as we go through these different features and structures, we're going to take a look at, right, the kidney, the ureter, sure, but we're also going to look at some of the smaller structures, right, something called a nephron, which is a little unit within the actual kidney itself, right? That's the actual unit which is going to produce the urine, right? We're going to look at some of the different, some of the different epitheliums, some of the different tissues that we see lining the ureter, some of the different tissues that we see lining the inside of the kidney. Right? All of these things are important. All right. As far as where the kidneys are, right? For instance, if you stand up and you kind of just take both your fists and kind of put them behind your back, just kind of about where the swell of your back is, to the side. Right? That's where the kidneys are. Now, you can see the kidneys are referred to as what's called retroperitoneal. If you remember, This would have been referencing way back to, we mentioned it a little bit in digestion, but really these membranes were covered way back in 121, probably sometime in August. Something called the peritoneum. That's what lines the abdominal cavity. Right, the parietal peritoneum lines the abdominal cavity. The visceral peritoneum lines much of the viscera within the abdominal cavity. They do not line the kidneys, right? The kidneys are retroperitoneal. So for instance, if we look at this image down here, right, this blue line, right, that represents the parietal peritoneum, right, the parietal peritoneum. You can see the kidneys are behind it. Here's that blue line. I'm going to draw it red now, but here it is. And it goes all the way up around the front side here. Right. So the kidneys lie retroperitoneally. Right. Now, as I mentioned, your kidneys, they're about the size of your fist, right, give or take. You can see kind of hugged where they are. There's really not a whole lot of rib protection to the kidneys. There's a little bit, right? Your lower, some of the lower ribs, right? Really, ribs 11, 12, right? A little bit of 10, but by and large, the kidneys aren't terribly protected by the ribs. A little bit, but definitely the bottom portion hangs out. Where you can see a little better in this image up and through here, right? Here's the 10th rib right here. Right, so the 10th rib would wrap around and probably be somewhere about halfway through the kidney. And then 11 and 12, 11 comes out and then 12 comes out just a little bit, even less so. So, like I mentioned, it's not like it's this great bony vault like the lungs within the thoracic cavity, or it's not this great bony vault like the brain inside of the cranium. Right, it's not at all like that. So this here, right, when we actually take a kidney, kind of blow it up, right, here's what we're looking at. Again, kidney. Here's the kidney all in through here. Now, sitting on top of the kidney is a gland, something called the adrenal gland, or something called the suprarenal gland. Same thing, your choice. Right, we covered this quite a bit in the endocrine system, right, when we talked about the production of cortisol, right, for instance, from the zona fasciculata, when we talked about the production of aldosterone from the zona glomerulosa, right, there's different regions within the adrenal gland, right, the release of epinephrine from the adrenal medulla, right, but here are some of the vessels, and we'll take a closer look at them later, right, but you can see some of the vessels which feed into the kidney, right, renal vein, renal artery, the suprarenal arteries. Yeah, the suprarenal go to the suprarenal gland, or the adrenal gland. Right, but here's the kidney. This is what it looks like. Cool. So, how deep are the kidneys? I mean, really, if anything, going, starting from the back and going deeper, they're much closer to that surface. But if we just go from the anterior, right, if we just kind of start to remove, for instance, the skin here, right, we start to remove some more of the connective tissue. Now we start to expose the liver. Right, for instance, this guy up in here, it's all liver. Beneath that, the gallbladder. This gallbladder is definitely quite large. Right, gallbladders are not generally that big. Right, so it's definitely a large gallbladder. Up here, where you can kind of see the curvature of the stomach. Right, that's the stomach. This kind of yellowish fatty mass, that's part of what's called the omentum. Right, this is the guy that has a really high affinity for alcohol. Right, this is what causes that, colloquially called, that beer belly, if you will. For whatever reason, the accumulation of adipose tissue through the consumption of ethanol, for whatever reason, has a real high affinity for this adipose tissue here. So that's what gives them that quintessential beer belly. Right? So, removing the omentum, shaving off some of the liver, shaving off some of the gallbladder. Right? We can start to expose the small intestine, all in through here. Now we still have not reached the kidneys. Nope. We have not made it deep enough yet. Once we remove the stomach, once we remove even the pancreas, right? The pancreas would have been somewhere around right in through here. That's been removed. Right? We've removed the small intestine. We've removed the large intestine. And once we do that, now we can expose the kidneys. This guy here and this guy here. Now, this vessel here, right, that's the renal vein. Blood is going to exit the kidney and enter into this big large vessel here called the inferior vena cava, and that carries blood up to the heart. Cool. One thing about, right, the size of these vessels, as I mentioned, the kidneys receive an enormous blood supply. So because of that, they have to have, substantially larger vessels than they otherwise would, right? Because they're only the size of your fist. They're not that big. They only make up maybe, 4 to 5% of your body's mass, not even. So to receive that much blood is tremendous. So remove the inferior vena cava. Right, we can remove some of the capsule of the kidney, and we start to expose some of the innards. And we start to see. Now, we're going to point these things out later. Don't worry. Right now, this image being zoomed in like this, it's not the crispest. It's not the clearest image. That's okay. We're going to look at some really crisp images here in a couple of minutes. But a couple of things we can see, I know you're able to see. If you look kind of right through here, you see how there's like a funnel shape right here? Up here too, there's like a funnel shape. Yeah, that's essentially what kind of happens. I think if I want to take whatever, a giant glass of water, or if I want to pour a liquid from a large container into a smaller container, what do I grab? I grab a funnel. Right? That funnel captures all that liquid and directs it into one very specific stream. The same idea here. Right? There are all these different structures inside of the kidney. Right? There are things called nephrons. We'll talk about them a little bit later on. But they, by and large, they produce the urine. And that urine gets channeled or funneled down into these different structures right in through here, and eventually it gets funneled into what's called the ureter, and the ureter then takes that urine and stores that urine in the urinary bladder. Right. So again, we are going to look at all these different structures in just a couple of minutes. Right here, right. This is just looking at some overview, some just kind of macro structures of the urinary system. Right, so we have the kidney. Alright, no big shocker. The perirenal fat, around renal kidney. Yeah, this perirenal fat, like I mentioned, the kidneys don't have this tremendous bony structural support or protection. Right, so one of the abilities of our body to protect the kidneys lies within this perirenal fat. Hence the reason why you see this perirenal fat surround the kidneys. Right, coming off of the kidney is the ureter, carrying urine from the kidney down into the bladder. I think you can see it right here, ureter. And then right over here, here's where we have the bladder. just like, oh, there's certain parts of muscle, or oh, there's certain parts of the bone, or there's certain parts of the stomach, right? Same exact idea with the kidney, right? The outermost part of the kidney, get highlighted by the green here. That is the renal cortex, or just the cortex. Right, renal cortex, or just the cortex, that's fine. This kind of fleshy pulp, if you will, that is the medulla. That is the medulla. Right, these are regions, right? The renal cortex, the renal medulla, those are regions. I'm going to jump to this one. When you look at these two images here, right, if you look at the medulla and the pyramids, you might be like, wow, the hell, they look exactly the same. Yes, they do. Right. Think of it this way. Right, your fingers are a part of your hand. Right, there's your hand, and your fingers are a part of that. Right, so the medulla, that's like the hand, like that's the region, right? It's your hand. The pyramids are specific structures within the medulla, right? Like your fingers are specific structures of the hand. Does that make sense? Right, so like if I look at it over on this thing that I'm circling, I could do it with all of them. I'm not going to. This individual structure is the pyramid. Right, but the region is the medulla. Alright. Now, in between the pyramids, so for instance, like here, there are things called renal columns. I think I'm going to call them a tall, thin structure. Yeah, these are kind of tall and thin. Or especially, you can see it really well. Right, kind of tall and thin. Tall and thin. Tall and thin. Right, tall and thin. Tall and thin. Right, so it's... Right, these structures here, those are the renal columns. Again, those are in between the pyramids. So when we look at it from a macro, or sorry, from a micro standpoint, right, from a histologic standpoint, this is the kidney. There's the renal medulla on the left. There's the renal cortex on the right. Now, when you look at this, you might say, "Well, all right, I got nothing. I don't have a clue what the heck I'm looking at." That's okay. You don't need to know right now, right? That's eventually you learn this stuff and you'll get it. But there's some specific things that you want to look for. Right, for instance, this thing here. A little bit later on, we're going to look at these things. But there are specific structures that we see in the cortex that I could scour all of this, and I don't see anything in this square or this rectangle that looks like that. I don't see anything like that. So more onto the anatomy of the kidney. So I had mentioned how, right, there we go. The kidney kind of acts like funnels, right? They kind of drip down. For instance, if you look at the pyramid here, right, renal pyramid, renal pyramid, renal pyramid, etc. What actually happens, and I'm actually going to back up a second and draw an arrow first. Little drop of urine. Okay. So when you look at this, these little tips of the pyramid are called the renal papillae. or the renal papillae. Choice is yours, doesn't matter. Right? Renal papillae or renal papillae. It's up to you. But what happens is, inside of these pyramids are these structures called nephrons. They are there again. They're the unit which actually produces the urine. They produce the urine, and that urine drips off of the papillae. Literally, like grab your finger, dip it into some water, and pick it up, and that water is going to travel down to the tip of your finger and fall off the very tip of your finger. Think of the tip of your finger as being like the papillae, right? It's the tip of the pyramid, if you will. So as the papillae, as that urine drips off the papillae, right up here is a great example of one. Papillae, as it drips, you can imagine how that drip of urine gets caught right here. Well, guess what? That's something called the minor calyx, or the minor calyce. Right here, minor calyce. And again, there's one with corresponds to each pyramid. It's not like there's just one or two. If there's 7 pyramids, there'd be 7 of these minor calyces. Or the same thing. These renal papillae drip urine down into the minor calyx. The minor calyx acts like the funnel. It collects it, it captures it. Awesome. From the minor calyx, you can see how there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But you can see how these 8 combine, and I see 1, 2, 3. Oops, there we go. Much better. Right? They combine, and I see, again, these 1, right, 2, and 3. Really, you can say just 2 if you want, but the large number of minor calyces combine, and since they combine, they then reduce the number of calyces that there actually are. That's why you see minor calyce, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 ish. For the major calyx, I see 1, 2, possibly a third, right, depending on whether you want to call this one or the merging of 2. But just like the there was numerous minor calyces that combined and formed fewer major calyces, same thing happens again. Right here. Right, the major calyce, the major calyce here and the major calyce here combined, and they feed into the renal pelvis. Right here. That's the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis then transitions into what's called the ureter. Again, the ureter, that is the tube which is going to carry the urine down into the urinary bladder. So here, right, this just to kind of give you a little bit of an actual, actual kind of drawing. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of point out from this image is this thing up here. Right, this thing called a nephron. Right? This nephron, that is the actual structure, or that is the actual functional unit which produces the urine. So as it produces the urine travels through all these squiggly lines here. They're all different tubes. We'll talk about them later. Goes all the way to that renal papillae, and it drips off from the papillae into the minor calyce. Right, from the minor calyce into the major calyce. All the major calyces dump into the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis then feeds down into the ureter. So on and so forth. Alright, cool. So you can see. Now, we've talked about here, down. The collecting duct, that gets a little bit more involved when we at a much more microscopic scale. Right? When you think about it, the nephron, right? This unit here, this unit which actually produces the urine. Right? There's around ballpark 1 million nephrons in each kidney. So yeah, they're very small, right? They're microscopic. You're not going to be able to see these with with your own eyes. So again, we talked about from here down. We have yet to talk about the collecting duct, and we will, right? And we will. When we start to get into the kidney, right? When we look here at the nephron, remember this again? This thing I just talked about here. This is the actual functional unit of the kidney. This is the actual unit of the kidney, which is going to start to produce the urine. This is what it looks like, just a little bit more blown up, if you will. Now, at the beginning of this, I kind of talked briefly about it. We'll talk a lot more about it later on. But I talked briefly about how the fact that the only reason our kidney can filter the blood is because the blood is, the kidney receives a plentiful supply of blood. We're going to talk more specifically, okay, great, more blood went to the kidney, but what actual part of the kidney? Right? And it's the fuel filter, right? The blood filter, if you will, right? This structure here, right? This first part of the nephron, right? Blood enters into it. Some filtrates produced, basically what's going to become urine is produced, and it leaves via something called the proximal convoluted tubule. The next 8 or 10 slides, that's where we're going to be spending our time. That's what we're going to be talking about. But the first thing we're going to talk about, again, is this structure right here, being what's called the renal corpuscle. Right, there's the nephron. The renal nephron is made up of the renal corpuscle. Got a little overzealous there on the L. And the renal tubule. Alright, so nephron equals renal corpuscle plus the renal tubule. The first thing we're going to look at is the renal corpuscle, this guy right here. That's the first thing we're going to look at. Now, in saying that, there are many smaller structures which make up the renal corpuscle. Right? So when I start talking about things like glomerulus, and this here is the is the structure where the urine is produced. Like, yeah, the nephron's where it's produced, but it is more specific. There are more specific structures that make up the nephron. Right? Just like there are more specific structures which make up the corpuscle. So from that slide, or the image we saw, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 slides ago, we looked at this to look at the difference between the renal medulla and the renal cortex. And one of the things I had mentioned was this structure here, or here, or here, or here. Right? You don't see that over here. Right? So when that happens, right, think of cortex corpuscle. Right? You can see the renal corpuscle, right, in the renal cortex. Right? That's what these are here. Right? If I back up, right, this bulbous looking thing right here, that's what this is. And this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this down here. Right, those are part of those are within the renal cortex, and those are what are called the renal corpuscle. Now, as I mentioned, the renal corpuscle is made up of numerous structures. All right. This whole thing, right, this whole thing here, this is a renal corpuscle. Now when you look, you can see some very clear as day, right, structures or things, right? For one, you can see this space here, all the way around, all the way around. That's something called Bowman's space, or something called the capsular space. Choice is yours, whichever one you want to call it. This is the space which is going to capture the fluid that's destined to become urine. Marcus, let's think about it. Imagine if I took a sponge, took that sponge, stuck it in the thing of water, and then pulled the sponge out and I stuck it in a thing of Tupperware, and I squeezed the sponge. You can envision how, as I squeeze the sponge, all that liquid comes out of the sponge, but yet that liquid is captured within the Tupperware. Right? That's the same exact idea as the capsular space. Right? Blood enters into this structure here. Again, it's blue one up in here called the glomerulus. So that's the sponge in my analogy. Right? Blood enters into the glomerulus, and that forces blood, or forces liquid. It's squished out, and as it's squished out, it's captured in the capsular or the Bowman's space. Right? Now, in order for blood to actually get into the glomerulus, again, the glomerulus, that is just a tuft of capillaries. Right? What is tuft of capillaries? Literally, it's a small hodgepodge, not hodgepodge, a small, very complex, interwoven, intertwined series of capillaries, right? All just kind of chaotically, wound together, if you will. Right? What feeds that is something called the afferent arteriole, which is a structure that we see right down here. Afferent arteriole. Afferent arteriole. The what's called DCT and PCT. The DCT is something that refers to the distal convoluted tubule. The PCT is something which refers to the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, when you look at that, you're like, I don't know, they look both round to me. I don't really see any difference whatsoever. You're 100% correct. Certain aspects of the distal and proximal convoluted tubule don't really look any different. Some aspects do, certain parts, but by and large, right, most parts don't look really any different. So you have to go by location. You see how in the glomerulus here, where there's like an opening here, right? There's all capsular space all around through here, but it stops right here. It stops there and it stops there. So we know there's got to be blood vessels going through here. Cool. So because there's blood vessels going through there, right, the distal convoluted tubule is going to hug right along those blood vessels. So this here is a distal convoluted tubule, just like we see right here. Distal convoluted tubule. Now, later on, I don't know if we'll get to, I think we'll get to it today. Part of how this works, the renal tubule, right, so the distal convoluted tubule, that is a part of the, think of it as being the modification center of the urine, right? When we think about the urine, right, what comes out of the renal corpuscle is not entirely eliminated. Right, and what I mean by that is the renal corpuscle, right, remember the nephron is the renal corpuscle in the renal tubule. The renal corpuscle produces a lot of fluid, which is destined to become urine. It's the renal tubule's responsibility to filter out that filtrate. Therefore, certain molecules, for instance, like glucose, molecules like sodium, potassium, chloride, right, to making sure that they aren't gotten rid of. So it's the renal tubule's responsibility to collect them. So one of the other parts of the renal tubule, specifically the distal convoluted tubule, I'm getting a little bit ahead, but it explains why the location is important. You'd all agree, or we all know, oh, if I drink more urine, let's try that one again. Yeah, drink urine. You could, sure, drink urine. It could be like Rip Torn off Dodgeball, drank his own urine because he liked the taste. It's a great movie. If you haven't seen it, highly recommend it. Anyways, if you drink more water, right, if you drink more water, the urine becomes more dilute. Meaning, if you drink a lot of water, your urine looks almost like water. If you don't drink a lot of water, you're sweating, and you're out exercising in the heat, losing lots of sweat, right? You're losing lots of water. Your urine is going to be very, very concentrated. Your urine is going to be yellow, right, and dark. And part of the reason why your body has the ability to do that, to regulate the concentration of the urine, has to do with the renal tubule. And part of that is how the distal convoluted tubule travels so closely to the arteriole. Remember the afferent arteriole? This is what's going to carry blood into the glomerulus. The distal convoluted tubule can actually impact the size of that afferent arteriole. That impact, that we're going to save until the very end, as far as factors affecting flow and rate in which blood travels through the glomerulus. That is much more complex. We are definitely going to save that for the end. So this here, right, this is just another view of the renal corpuscle. Remember the nephron, that is the corpuscle plus the renal tubules. So this here, right, how I mentioned, right, this structure inside of the corpuscle, right, this thing here that I'm surrounding, this is something called the glomerulus. This is just a big tuft of capillaries, right? Think of this big intertwined bed of capillaries. There's a vessel right here, something called the afferent arteriole. Later on at the end, we're going to look at the blood vessels, right, which ones actually kind of bring the blood into the kidney and how it's dispersed. But for right now, just the afferent arteriole, that's the vessel which brings the arterial blood into the glomerulus. Right, so as blood enters in here, enters into the glomerulus, and then again just does its thing all in through here. So as blood is traveling through the glomerulus, let me ask this question. Imagine if you bought just a really cheap garden hose. I'm talking just like super cheap. It's kind of flat and dilapidated, right? It's just kind of the wall of it's kind of weak. And if there's no water traveling through it, it stays kind of flattened. Hook that garden hose up to a spigot and turn on the spigot. Think about what the hose does. It starts to swell, right? That water pushes out against the wall of the hose, right? And the hose expands a little bit and propels the water forward down the line. That exact same concept occurs inside of the glomerulus. Right? As blood travels down through the glomerulus, let's just say it travels in this first one, small amounts of fluid leak through the wall and dump into the glomerular space, or Bowman's space. Now, not everything can fit. There's structures here. There's these, I don't know, fishbone looking things. Right? Those are called podocytes. We'll look at those in a minute. But those are partly responsible for regulating what can and can't leave. Right? Just think about taking your fingers and kind of interlacing them together. Right? As you start to separate your hands, small little kind of cracks and crevices form between your fingers. Right? Now think of interlacing your fingers, right? Looking at your palms, put your fingers interlaced together. And if you have like a marble or something like that, put a marble in your hand. Oh, it's still in your hand. It's still there. And then slowly start to separate your fingers. And eventually one of those cracks and crevices will be big enough that the marble will fit through. Right? Well, when you look at these podocytes, again, those fishbone looking things, right? All these fishbone looking things in through here, there's little cracks and crevices, right? Little cracks and crevices, and many molecules are far too large to fit. They have to remain in the bloodstream, right? Proteins, for instance, right? Proteins are, let's just say proteins are this big. Well, as that protein travels through the blood, is it going to be able to fit through this little crack and crevice here? No way. Can't do it. Because it can't do it, that protein then remains in the blood. But some of the fluid portion, some of the electrolytes, sodium, potassium, chloride, glucose, right, small molecules like that, can fit through these little tiny slits. And when it does, that fluid portion, as well as any of the dissolved, particles, any of the dissolved minerals inside of it, go along with it. When it's captured here in this Bowman space or Bowman's capsule, I'm sorry, when it's in the Bowman space or the glomerular space, it's not called urine at that point. It's called filtrate. Filtrate. Now this is the stuff, it will become urine. Down the line, it will become urine. But before it becomes urine, we have the ability to modify what's inside, what is actually within this fluid. So it's not called urine yet. If it's urine, I am getting rid of it. It's in the urinary bladder. It's in the ureter. I can't pull anything more from it than I wanted to. So here, at this point, it's simply called the filtrate, because it's what was filtered out. So the next piece is when that filtrate, let me get some of this stuff out of here. Again, the filtrate. When it dumps into and it's collected in the capsular space, you can see as it accumulates, well, there's only one place for it to go, and that's down this opening right here. That opening leads into something called the proximal convolular tubule. That's the beginning part of where the modification of the filtrate begins. Right? But before we get into that, right, we've got more things to cover here in the glomerulus. Some things that we see. Alright, so here's the afferent arteriole that brings the blood into the glomerulus. Cool. This thing here, right, that's a neuron. Right, via sympathetic stimulation, that actually causes the afferent arteriole to constrict. When it constricts, that's going to reduce the amount of blood flowing into the afferent arteriole. So if we have less blood flowing through the afferent arteriole, that means we have less blood traveling through the glomerulus. If there's less blood traveling through the glomerulus, that means there's less pressure in the glomerulus. If there's less pressure in the glomerulus, that means we produce less filtrate. And if we produce less filtrate, we produce less urine. Whoa. Right, so it is, right, the size of the afferent arteriole, the size of how much blood gets into the glomerulus is hugely important, right? The more blood that gets into the glomerulus, say let's draw a couple arrows here, the more blood that gets in, the more that leaves, the more filtrate that's produced. If, right, we have less filtrate, or if there's less blood traveling into the glomerulus, we simply produce less filtrate. Okay, cool. So things that are going to help, or that kind of modify or alter the size of the afferent arteriole, again, sympathetic stimulation from the brain itself. But over here, right, this thing here, this tube here, we see ascending limb of the nephron loop. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. But ascending limb of the nephron loop, as well as sometimes it's what's called the distal convolular tubule. Remember this tube that began way over here? Right, this thing goes around, and it squiggles around and around and around, and towards the end of it, we see it again emerge here, and then it goes and eventually ends. Right, dumps into the collecting duct, and it dumps into some other structures. Right, but we see this tube way at the end here, and the reason that's important, that's going to help to adjust the size of the afferent arteriole. Right, think of it. If there's too much filtrate, let's say, oh, we produced a bunch of filtrate. Alright, if we produced a bunch of filtrate, that means more filtrate enters into the tubule. If more filtrate enters into the tubule, just like that garden hose, the tubule is going to distend. Same thing at the end of the line, right? As this tube distends, that cues the kidney, hey, there's too much filtrate being produced. So, what happens? If there's too much filtrate being produced, there's a couple of cells. There's a complex called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Right now you're like, whoa, what is that? We see the juxtaglomerular cells, right, the macula densa, right, the mesangial cells. These all can regulate how much blood gets into the glomerulus, because again, the more blood that gets into the glomerulus, the more filtrate we end up producing. Right. All right. Now, once blood enters into the glomerulus, does its thing, swirls around, great. We've produced filtrate. We've produced filtrate. We've produced filtrate. Then now it's time for the blood to leave. And when it leaves, it does so via the efferent or the efferent arteriole. The efferent arteriole. The efferent arteriole, that is the way the blood is going to exit the glomerulus. Alright. Now, regulating how much, right? Now, I'm not going to talk about the pressure inside of the glomerulus and blood pressure and all that kind of stuff. I'm not talking about that yet. But from a structural standpoint, right, we can look at these kind of cracks and crevices and these little slits, these pores, which exist, which can modify and regulate what structures can and can't leave. So, again, take a small piece of the glomerulus, blow it up. This is what we are looking at here. Right. So, we can see penetration or a pore of the glomerular endothelium. Yeah, there's already these little tiny holes. Right? Think of a cheese grater. Right? They're small enough holes. If you have small enough seeds, or if you have small enough whatever it is, small enough beads, right? They fit through those holes. Again, same exact idea with these fenestrations or with these pores, right? But that's not the only thing, right? When we look here, we see, right, the filtration slits, these slits here, right? There's a whole series of different structures which can help to modify what is actually going to be in the filtrate and what isn't. Right? Anything that's inside of the bloodstream in here, right? If it can't fit through these fenestrations, if it can't fit through these pores, if it can't fit through these pores, then it cannot possibly enter into the filtrate. Can't do it. That's why that's part of the issue when somebody has renal disease, for instance. Right? Let's imagine this hole, instead of being, that big, it's now that big. Well, that's like people who have certain, liver pathology, but certain kidney pathology, right? Certain kidney disease, right? They have elevated levels of protein in the urine, for instance, and part of that has to do with the fact that, yeah, they have an inability to, or they have a difficulty regulating and maintaining appropriate protein levels, for instance, because the proteins are now being filtered out and being located in the filtrate. They aren't supposed to be able to fit through these pores. They aren't supposed to be able to leave the glomerulus, but in the presence of pathology, they do. So here's just an up close and personal, right? Again, scanning scope, 5,000 magnification, so yeah, pretty significant. But you can see, right, these little fingers which come down here. Again, these are the pedicels, the fingers of the podocyte, which all come down. Kind of act like strainers, right? If it doesn't fit between this, it's not getting out. And here, this is just to actually look at the, right, kind of the space between the blood and between that of the capsular space, right? You can see how, right, the size, or the size between the wall of the, right, the size between the endothelial cells of the blood vessel, right, is, let's just call it, to make it simple, let's say it's an inch. It's way less than that, right? But let's just say, oh, this is an inch between the endothelial cells of the blood vessel. Look how close together, right, these pedicels are. Right? If this was an inch, this is a quarter of an inch, right? So we have a much better ability to regulate what's going to be in the filtrate. Now, in saying that, there's still a huge number of molecules that we get rid of in the urine, that we get rid of in the filtrate, like glucose, a lot of electrolytes, certain fatty acids, vitamins. Many of those things we are going to eventually reabsorb, because remember when I had mentioned the filtrate all gets shunted down into the proximal convoluted tubule, and this is where the filtration process occurs. Right, when you filter water, for instance, in a Brita filter or a Brita pitcher or whatever, there's electrolytes which still remain in the water, but there are certain chemicals, certain toxins, certain wastes that are removed. Same idea here. The filtrate contains a lot of waste product, but it also contains a lot of beneficial electrolytes, vitamins, glucose. Those are the sorts of things that we eventually want to reabsorb, and we can do that along the renal tubule. Right, so again, here within the glomerulus that produces the filtrate, within the corpuscle that produces the filtrate, and that then shunts that filtrate down into the first part of the renal tubule. That first part, that is what's called the proximal convoluted tubule. Right? Here, this thing, right? That produces the renal corpuscle, that produces the filtrate. Right? That produces the filtrate. The renal tubule, all of this stuff, that modifies it. I'm just going to write mods. So, just because something is in the filtrate, glucose, sodium, potassium, etc., doesn't mean, crap, it's lost forever. Nope, not the case. Right? We have this entire structure here, being the tubule, to be able to adjust, pull things from the filtrate that otherwise would have become urine. At the same token, we're able to get rid of additional waste products that we otherwise wouldn't have. So again, that occurs in this structure here. So when we first look at, right, the proximal convoluted tubule, right, we see, right, you can envision how this is a tube. Take a pack of straws, grab a hold of the straws, and look down them. That's kind of what we're doing. Right, here's the straw here. Here's a straw here. Right, look down that straw, length of that straw. You're looking down the length of that straw right here, and right here. That tubule, again, that's lined, right, the lining here, simple cuboidal epithelium. Simple cuboidal epithelium. And all of these vessels, right, all of this here, all of this through here, here, all of this here, here, this reddish stuff, that's all blood vessels. Those are all blood vessels. That's how vascular the kidneys are. All of this. So, if there's, let's just say, if there is sodium inside of the tubule, we are able to reabsorb that sodium into the bloodstream. Again, that occurs along different aspects of the tubule. Sodium in particular is important, right? Because remember, what do we remember about water? Or what do we remember about osmosis? Right? Water is a follower. Water will follow. Alright? So, in keeping with this example, if sodium gets reabsorbed from the tubule and re-enters the bloodstream, what does water do? Water follows. Right, does that make sense? Right, and you can see, right, on this, this chart here, right, do you have to remember every single thing on this? No. But when we look at it, right, reabsorption, as far as those things which are reabsorbed from the tubule into the bloodstream, you can see, right, water, sodium, potassium, glucose, amino acids, chloride, right, bicarb, urea, right? There are a number of different molecules which are reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. The next part, again, what's called the nephron loop, the loop of the nephron, or the loop of Henle. Those are all, those are all the same thing. Call it whatever you want. Now, depending on where we are at, right, whether we are in the descending limb going down, or whether we're in the ascending limb going up, along the tubule, the proximal convoluted tubule, not so much. It's not really impermeable to much of anything. When I say impermeable, yeah, meaning pretty much any molecules can travel through the proximal convoluted tubule. when we entered into the loop of Henle, right, up through the distal convoluted tubule, through the collecting duct, this is where different aspects of that tubule permit the movement of certain molecules while it is impermeable to others. For instance, right, here, the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Water, come on, for Pete's sake. Go on here. H2O, right? The ascending limb of the loop of Henle does not permit water. It is impermeable to water. Water cannot leave, right, the ascending limb. Has no choice. It cannot. It's impermeable to it. Right. At the end, right, we are going to look at kind of why this is important. Why is it that the certain aspects of the tubule are permeable while others are impermeable? And that has to do with our ability to concentrate the urine, right? Think about it. Sometimes our urine is looks like water. Drink a bunch of water, I'm going to get rid of a lot of water. It's very dilute. Other times, it's very concentrated. It's like yellowish, right? Our entire ability to modify the concentration of the urine has to do with the movement as well as the lack of movement of water and electrolytes through the tubule. So when we look at the loop of Henle, right, if we look, I'm going to kind of line it here. In there. Right, you see it's very thin. The collecting duct is massively large, we'll point it out in a minute. That's huge, right? That's this here. And these cells are the wall. Right, so from here to here, that's collecting duct, but the loop of Henle is very thin. Right here, that's what we see. So you can see, right, reabsorption, water, sodium, potassium, again, more minerals, right, as we saw before. Now, something we saw in the proximal convoluted tubule as well as now we're seeing it in the loop of Henle, urea. There's something called urea as well as creatinine. They are variable as to how much is actually eliminated, right? It's highly variable, right? So that's why I haven't really talked about it, because it really depends on where we're at, and it depends on the activity level of the body. The third portion of the tubule here, right, something called the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal convoluted tubule here, and then this big large tube here, this is the collecting duct. So we look at this, if we look, for instance, right here, if we look, for instance, here, these stems that we see here, as well as what we see here, here and here, these are the distal convoluted tubules, right, the ending of them, just like this, from other nephrons. So that you have multiple nephrons dumping into one collecting duct. All right, does that make sense? Because remember, that one collecting duct, right, then feeds into, right, think about it, what's it feed into if you remember? Too far. There we go. That collecting duct feeds down to the tip, right, that papillae, and as the urine drips off, it is funneled into the minor calyx, and then from the minor calyx into the major calyx, right, from the major calyx into the renal pelvis, the renal pelvis down into the ureter. Okay. So here, now, when you look at this, you're like, oh, I see renal corpuscle here. berry looking thing, renal corpuscle here. There are certain structures you can see, right? This whitish space here, that is Bowman's space, or the capsular space, or the glomerular space. Choice is yours. All of this is all glomerulus. It's all glomerulus. You can even see the afferent arteriole here. Really? Yep. Right here. Right, these are red blood cells. How the heck do I know that? You see red blood cells scattered throughout this image. Here. 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 Remember, red blood cells are anucleate. They don't have nuclei. Right, and these cells are much more red in appearance. But the biggest thing is they don't have nuclei. Remember, your red blood cells have basically flushed the organelles in order to maximize how much oxygen, carbon dioxide, they're capable of carrying. But one of the important things about where the distal convoluted tubule is we see it right here, for instance. Right? We see a portion of it. This one's kind of distended. There. This one is cut off. You can see it there. Right? But if I back up, remember how I'd mentioned, right, with the glomerulus, with the renal corpuscle, excuse me. The proximal convoluted tubule wraps around, becomes loop of Henle. Right, as it comes back up, the loop of Henle and that becomes the distal convoluted tubule. Right, so here, in the ascending limb, let's go fast forward. Right, as we're coming up right through here, and about this region right here is where the distal convoluted tubule is going to begin. Right, so whenever you look for the distal convoluted tubule, you want to be looking right around the region of, again, the afferent arteriole, which is feeding the renal corpuscle. Lastly, the large, again, I mentioned it a minute ago, right, what the tubule is going to feed into is something called the collecting duct. Right, the collecting duct. It's large. They're very large. Right, here's a collecting duct. There's another one down here. Another one up here. Right, so those are the collecting, again, I'll even draw this one here. Perfect. Now, throughout the tubule, right, there's different hormones. Right, we talked about aldosterone, for instance. Remember, covering the endocrine system, aldosterone being released from the zona glomerulosa. Right, that helped to retain fluid. Right, so you produce less urine. The reason, or how aldosterone works, is it regulates sodium, or how much sodium is reabsorbed. The same token, right, antidiuretic hormone, okay, so you retain fluid. As you retain fluid, where antidiuretic hormone has an impact is on the collecting duct. Right? I had mentioned how the entire ability of our body to regulate the concentration of the urine has to do with how easily do molecules move through the tubule. That's where these different hormones have an impact, right? Antidiuretic hormone, all right? So it means I'm going to retain water. So if I want a more concentrated urine, let's imagine in the collecting duct here, if there's a super concentrated amount of urine, what would water do? Would water want to go from the blood and enter into the collecting duct? Or would water go from the collecting duct and enter into the blood? Well, if there's a super concentrated level of urine in the collecting duct, water is a follower. So water would want to jump into the collecting duct. That's a problem. The urine's concentrated for a reason. I haven't drank any water in a while. I've just exercised, hypothetically exercised a bunch, right? And I just sweat everywhere. I've lost a lot of urine, lost a lot of water through sweating. So the urine would be concentrated. I don't want water to be entering into the collecting duct. So antidiuretic hormone reduces the permeability of water to the collecting duct, meaning that water can no longer travel through the wall of the collecting duct, which is good, because I don't want that water to leave the blood vessel and enter into the collecting duct. That's not what I want. So again, later on at the end, we'll look at some of the different features, structures, some of the different hormones which are responsible for adjusting the composition of the blood, or the composition of the urine, excuse me. One of the things to kind of pay attention to here, we're on this image here. I remember I pointed out blood vessel here, here, down and through here, 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 so on and so on. I could go on. Right? Over through here, here. When we look, this one's a little bigger. When we look at the renal corpuscle as well as the renal tubule, you can see it is absolutely just surrounded, encapsulated, just surrounded by a capillary bed. That's something called the vasa recta. That's something called the vasa recta. All right, you can also see them. You might also see them called the peritubular capillaries. Right, peri, around, tubular. Oh yeah, they're around the tubes. All right, so whichever one you want to call it's totally fine. But this is where molecules, right, like glucose, sodium, potassium, chloride, right, this is where they're going to enter and exit the tubule. So if there was sodium in the proximal convoluted tubule here, and if it re-enters into the bloodstream, if it gets reabsorbed, it travels through the wall and enters into the capillary. And vice versa. If there is excess levels of sodium in the blood here, it gets secreted, and that can enter into the tubule. Because remember, anything left in the tubule at the end is going to become urine. But until that point, our body can secrete it, reabsorb it. Our body can pick and pull and choose what is and what is and isn't in the filtrate. Right? So again, the flow. Right? Once that filtrate's made its way down through the collecting duct, it's reached the renal papillae. From the renal papillae, that urine, draw a drop of urine. Yeah, that's supposed to be a drop. That looks more like a scrotum, but that's okay. Drop of urine drops down. When it drops down, another drop of urine. Perfect. That drop of urine goes from the minor calyce and eventually enters into the major calyx. The major calyx then drops down and feeds into the renal pelvis. The renal pelvis then drops down and feeds into the ureter. The ureter then travels all the way down and dumps into what's called the urinary bladder. Again, the urinary bladder, that's the storage port. That's where the urine is then stored. Right? So the next thing we're going to look at is the ureter. Right? These tubes. Right here. You can see it dumping down into the bladder. Same thing here. Dumping down into the bladder. Right? And then we see them here. So these structures, right, they have to be able to distend or stretch. Right? Think about it. There's just like that garden hose. When water runs through it, it swells. Same thing with the ureter. As urine enters into it, it has to be able to swell. Now, one of the things to not get confused with, commonly, right, these things here, we commonly confuse these as the ureters, right? Because they're kind of in the same spot and they're really long and tall, right? The problem, though, right, these are not the ureters, right? These are actually arteries, right? Gonadal arteries. Right? You would have covered those last semester in the cardiovascular system. The ureters are right here. So when we look at the ureter, you can see, right, this line with transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium is designed to stretch, and it does so. Right? A very thickened mucosa, as we see through here, but the other part of it, you see a substantially thick muscularis layer. I mean, 2/3, 3/4 probably, call it 3/4 of the wall of the ureter is the muscularis layer, meaning 3/4 of the of the wall is just muscle, right? Which allows the contraction of the ureter, which, if you think about it, as the ureter contracts, for instance, let's imagine here it contracts and it pinches. It's almost kind of like peristalsis. It's not peristalsis, but kind of the same idea. This pinching, and then it kind of pulls and propels that urine down into the urinary bladder. Now, granted, you're like, wouldn't just gravity take over? Yeah, I mean, it would, but, right, there's anything we can do to kind of help propel, cause the urine to move more quickly through the ureter to that storage or that collection port. So the bladder, again, this guy right down in here, specifically the urinary bladder. There's multiple bladders in the body. The gallbladder, for instance, right? The urinary bladder, right? So don't just call it the bladder. It is the urinary bladder. There's structures within the urinary bladder. Right here we see the ureters, right? These horns coming up, just like this. Awesome. They then feed into the bladder. Now, the detrusor muscle, the wall of the bladder is called the detrusor muscle. Right, all of this here, that's the detrusor muscle. So when when your bladder empties, when you're actually urinating, it's the detrusor muscle which is contracting. As it contracts, it then pushes the urine. Again, pushes the urine through the opening, which the opening is the entrance into the urethra. Right. When we look here, something called a trigonus. This is like, just literally think of a funnel. A funnel, if you look at it, it kind of has a triangular shape. Right, there's the tube, or the tip of it here. But when you look at that funnel, it has that triangular shape, right? You think of a funnel, kind of this little thing like that, right? You would dump water into the top of the funnel, and that funnel then funnels it down into the urinary, or into the urethra. All right. But something else we see here, right? Right here, and over here. Something called the internal urethral sphincter. This is under smooth muscle control, involuntary control. Right, you don't consciously control this. Right, this is all done, this is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, right? And this is actually a muscle which is the first muscle which is stimulated to relax to allow for urination. There's something called the micturition reflex. Right, as the urinary bladder begins to distend, that triggers urination. So the first thing that happens is the internal urethral orifice, the internal urethral sphincter, begins to relax. As it relaxes, right? As it relaxes, urine is allowed to enter into. It enters through the orifice, which is the opening, and into the urethra. Now, fortunately, we have something called the external urethral sphincter. That's under skeletal muscle control. That you can voluntarily contract, and you do. That first urge of, oop, I gotta pee. You don't just start urinating everywhere, hopefully. Right? And the reason why we don't is because we're able to stop that through the external urethral sphincter. And that's this here. Alright, so urine is here in the bladder. Urine travels down through the, well, as the internal urethral sphincter relaxes, urine travels down through the internal urethral orifice and enters into the urethra, and then it can be stopped right here via the external urethral sphincter. And once you're finally in front of a toilet, a tree, buddy's gas tank, right, whatever it is, then you can actually start to then urinate. Alright. Here you can see, right, just like the ureter, so too does the urinary bladder need to distend. Right? Obviously, we don't have the same amount of urine in the bladder at all times. Not at all. Right? So it has to be able to distend. That's why we see all of this transitional epithelium up and through here. Again, right up and through here. Again, we see the lamina propria, we see the submucosa, and then we see the detrusor muscle. Right? This entire thickness. All of that. And it kind of makes sense, right? There has to be this substantial amount of force or muscle in order to generate enough muscle to overtake, right, the resistance from the urethra. Right, so the detrusor muscle contracts, and that's what then causes urination. Here's just an up close and personal of the epithelium, right, transitional epithelium, which allows for this kind of great distension of the bladder. So, right, remember with transitional epithelium, right, there isn't this basement membrane that it attaches to. Right, if you guys remember, again, I'm going way back to chapter 4. Right. So the male bladder, female bladder, right, the urinary bladders. Obviously, orientation, location's a little bit different. Now, it's not like, oh man, right, the bladder of men's like in their chest. No, I say it's different location. It's oriented slightly differently, and that's simply because the anatomy is different. Right, within the female pelvis, there's the urinary bladder. There's a uterus. There's ovaries. Right, in the male pelvis, there's a prostate, right, which is a small gland. Right, the scrotum, the phallus, they all hang outside of the body. Right, men don't have a uterus. Right, men don't have ovaries. Right, we have gonads, which is the male equivalent to ovaries. However, they hang outside of the body. Right, so it doesn't take up space, if you will, within the pelvic cavity. But one of the things, right, to kind of look at here, right, if we look at the length of the male urethra, I'm not sure why that random line appears sometimes, but the length of the male urethra, right, even the most underendowed individuals still have a urethra, which is 2-3 times the length of the phallus itself. Right, the urethra is much longer in males than it is in females. Right, this is part of the reason why, especially girls, right, young girls, kind of learning proper hygiene and that sort of thing. UTI, urinary tract infections, are much more common in females than in men, and it just has to do with a distance game, right? For that bacteria to get up, right, through the urethra all the way up through here, right, that's a long ways. Females, that's it. So what is it, half the length? Not even? Or excuse me, probably, the half the length. Not, it's probably a third of the length as far as the length of the urethra. That in conjunction with, again, the rectum being right here. So the opening, the closeness, right, the proximity of fecal matter to the opening of the urethra is immensely closer compared to that of men. Right, so this is the reason why UTIs, especially in young girls, is just so much more prevalent than it is as in young boys. Right, with boys, right? If you know what, your recurrent UTIs and that sort of thing, whereas young girls generally is chalked up to poor hygiene. Not by no means am I saying that young girls have poorer hygiene than young boys. I've had both, and my God, my son, if he didn't have to bathe, he wasn't forced to bathe, he wouldn't bathe. My whole point, though, is right because UTIs are much less common in boys because of the reasons we just mentioned, right? If there is recurrent UTIs in young boys, part of a workup that's done is to check for something called reflux. Basically, what happens? Let me get this off of here. When I say reflux, there's no valves or anything like that which prevent the urine from going back up into the ureters. But as the bladder contracts, it essentially pinches off this opening, so urine can't get back up into the ureter. If for some reason there's underdevelopment, or if for some reason when the bladder contracts, if there is urine which gets back up into the ureter, that's called reflux. Right now you're like, oh, acid reflux, my grandfather has that, he takes Prevacid. That's completely different, right? Kidney reflux, where urine's actually getting back up into the bladder. Where urine's actually getting back up into the ureter. And if it's significant enough, that urine can actually get back up into the kidney. That's where you can then start to have renal infections and that sort of thing. But again, that's that's definitely more common in boys for sure, right? So the kind of flow of urine, right? And I mentioned here, right, in males, right, the urinary bladder is here. The urethra, this tube right in through here, but there's some glands that it has to travel through first, right? This thing right here, this is the prostate. Prostate are only in males. Only men have prostates. That's it, right? Women, females don't have prostates. If they do, we need to have a talk. Alright? But this tube which goes through it, that's the urethra. Right? That's where the urethra begins. Right? It's part of the reason why men who have, like, for instance, BPH, right, benign prostatic hypertrophy, that's where, let's imagine this is a normal-sized prostate. BPH is where it becomes enlarged to, let's say, that size or bigger. So when that happens, well, you can just imagine if the prostate enlarges, right, that can cause a small amount of compression of the urethra. So that's why part of the reason why men who have BPH go to the bathroom so often is one of two things. One, as the prostate enlarges, it steals space from the bladder. But two, they have a difficulty in eliminating all of the urine because of the compression of the urethra through here, right? So the opening here, right, the opening right from the urinary bladder, the opening, right, is the orifice. The actual muscular component, right, that's the internal urethral sphincter. Then way down here, right, on this slide we see here, that's the external urethral sphincter. That is the external urethral sphincter. The part of the urethra which the urine is going to travel down through, right through here, this is the prostatic urethra. The prostatic urethra, yeah, that's the portion of the urethra which is still traveling through the prostate. Cool. Next, we have something called the membranous urethra. Right? The membranous urethra. Small little portion, maybe an inch. Right? Inch and a half, maybe. That's the membranous urethra. And then lastly, and by far the longest and largest, is something called the spongy urethra. Something called the spongy urethra. This is really the portion of the urethra which runs through the base and then the phallus itself. Right? And the reason why we call it spongy, there is different structures within the penis itself, where you can actually see some of them here, right? With that, these different structures, the spongy urethra, right? The spongy corresponds to these different caverns which exist in reproductive system. We'll talk about those caverns. It's actually what allows for erections to occur. But anyways, lastly, right, the hole at the tip of the penis where the urine actually then gets dispelled out, right? That's the external urethral orifice. The lower tract, right, for females, it's a little bit different in the sense that there's not a prostate, right? There's no prostate to be had, but there's many of the same similar structures, right? There's the internal urethral orifice, which is the opening, and then you have the muscles which surround it. Those are the internal urethral sphincter. Then you have just the urethra itself, where you don't have different portions of it, like where in males you had the prostatic urethra, the membranous urethra, the spongy urethra. In females, it's just the urethra. And then down here, right here, this is where we see the external urethral orifice. Alright. So this next portion of what we're going to get into, I'm actually going to create, I'm going to start to encode this, and I'll upload this presentation, and then I'll continue on with the next one. But this next portion here is where we start to get into looking at some of the vasculature. Now, I'm not going to go crazy in detail about the vasculature, but remember how I'd mentioned the only way that your kidneys can filter the blood is if that blood gets to the kidney. It's the only way. Right? So, up until this point, right, we've covered how urine, right, goes from the blood. Goes from the blood. Filtrate's produced. That filtrate then travels through the tubule. That tubule then goes all the way through the that filtrate goes all the way through the tubule. Eventually that filtrate enters into the collecting duct. That collecting duct then gives rise eventually to the urine. That urine then enters into the minor calyx, into the major, into the renal pelvis, into the ureter. Awesome. Then from the ureter down to the urinary bladder, and so on until it's, out of the body. We've covered that whole kind of tract and hold that entire pathway. In order to start to explain what can have a major and a tremendous impact on this, we've got to start to look at the bloodstream, or the actual blood supply entering into the kidney. I'd mentioned the afferent arteriole, right? I mentioned the afferent arteriole because that's the actual small arteriole which allows blood to enter directly into the glomerulus. Right, so the next presentation, that's where I'm going to pick up with, is looking at the blood supply to the kidneys and how that impacts all of the pressure inside of the glomerulus. Right, there's only 5 or 6 slides, right, on the next presentation, but it's going to be, it'll be not quite as long as this one, but it's going to be, even though it's only 5 slides, don't let it fool you. It's going to be quite a bit longer, because it's the application of understanding how the pressure inside the glomerulus is impacted by the blood flowing through it.